how many of you feel like you are comfortable with and understand the three cloud types, namely infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service? Show of hands. Great. Okay, I see some hands that are not up. So I'll explain briefly how we think about those things, but I'm going to be talking quite a bit beyond that. Okay, so infrastructure as a service simply means that you want to be able to use virtual servers as a service, essentially, and not have to worry about physical infrastructure either on your location or at a service provider. Platform as a service is you want someone else to take care of the application platform. You don't have to think about not just the physical infrastructure, but you don't want to think about virtual servers in the operating system. You just want to be able to drop your code straight into an application platform. And software as a service is when you don't even want to have to think about coding and the application platform, you just want to use an app. And Salesforce.com is the most famous of the commercial software as a service ones. So those are the three categories. Now, let's find out, let's zoom in on infrastructure as a service. The notion of you don't want to have to deal with the physical infrastructure, but there's still the open question of where do those virtual servers sit. So there's going to be three choices here, and I'd like a show of hand for what the primary interest is in infrastructure as a service. I'll give you all three choices, then we'll vote. So the first one is internal. You own the servers, you're running them on premise, but you're using it as if it were cloud, even though it's in your own data center and not at a service provider. So that's first choice, internal. The second one is hosted. It's at a third party. It might be Amazon, it might be IBM, doesn't matter. The point is it's not on your premise, it's somebody else's facility, and you're using the virtual servers as a service. And the third choice will be combo, or as it's often called, hybrid, where you're going to use some of each. So show of hands for what your primary interest is in infrastructure as a service, starting with internal. Okay, I see a handful of hands. Great. How about hosted, all at the service provider? Okay, fair number of hands, like maybe a quarter. And how about combination or hybrid, both places? Big show of hands. Okay, great. So now, let's keep going with the quiz. This helps me understand you as an audience, but it also helps the RightScale folks understand, and it organizes all of you all to know where you're at compared to the rest of the audience. How many of you feel like you're still learning about what cloud computing is versus how to do it, because you've already decided to do some aspect of it? So show of hands. Those of you who are learning what it is. Okay, we got a good little chunk of that. And how many of you how to do it? Great, okay. Now, we've got one more question, and that's about job function. And you'll see in my presentation why I'm asking this question. So I'm going to give you, see, I got to get this right here, 4 choices of sort of where you sit within your organization. So are you a are you a developer or an application person within a traditional IT organization? I'll give you the 4 choices, then we'll do hands, sorry. Second one is everybody else in a traditional IT organization except the developers or app folks. The third choice will be a business leader or executive, and let's put CIOs in that category. And then the last one is a technology capable or savvy person who is outside of IT. So this might be someone who is engineering a website, a social game, something like that, but you're not really part of what we call IT, right? Because you're doing a business function of some kind. Okay, so developers and application people inside IT, got a hand, oh, look at that. Okay, quite a few of you. All right, how about traditional IT folks, ops, admin, etc.? Great, quite a few of you all. All right. Business leader or executive, including CIOs. Wow, we got a great mix in this audience. All right, how about the technology capable or savvy person outside of IT, engineering cool stuff? Wow, this is a really mixed audience. I think what that is a tribute to RightScale's focus and draw. It really is a mix of things. And as you saw, it's quite a mix of sort of interests, abilities, and understanding in this audience too. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by looking at the IT end of the spectrum. But I'm going to come back and show you why that's not the right lens necessarily to look at and understand cloud computing infrastructure as a service. So we're going to start by telling you that the key theme here is the cloud conversation, as I like to call it, is quite confusing. I'm going to tell you, don't get distracted by the cloud hype. Focus on your workload and your business needs to understand this stuff. And that may mean you have to figure out significantly different solutions or answers for different parts of what you're thinking about. Because the cloud umbrella is so broad that it will mix you up if you use the generic cloud banner. And my simple extra piece of advice on this screen would be, don't use cloud as a noun. It's an adjective to help you think about what you're doing. And if even further test, if you want, is figure out how to talk about what you're doing without using the cloud word. Describe that, and then come back later and retrofit it where you need to be buzzword compliant, look good for your boss, whatever the requirement is. But try it without the cloud word, and you'll be much clearer on understanding what the heck you're talking about. All right, so Forrester surveys traditional IT buyers in a bunch of different ways. And I'm going to show you some survey data. I'm going to blitz through it really quickly. Here's what I want you to pay attention to with surveys. It matters who you survey. So I'm going to be really clear. Everything I'm showing you here is surveying the traditional IT infrastructure buyer, mostly an enterprise, i.e. 1,000 employees or more. There is one slide where I survey, in addition, software purchasers. So these are people with spending authority. And these surveys are for North America and Western Europe. And it's significant scale, hundreds of respondents done very carefully to try to get a representative sample. Okay, so you think broadly that, well, virtualization is a required element of infrastructure as a service, right? Yeah, it is. So first question is, to what extent have companies virtualized? So if you look at virtualization by company, 75% of companies report that they have implemented server virtualization. So sounds like we're pretty far down the path on implementing server virtualization in traditional IT, right? Wrong. Turns out that firms who have 100 or more x86 servers have only virtualized 15% of the OS instances, this little bar right here. So 371 companies in our sample, and they report only virtualizing 15% of their OS instances. Now I can quickly find companies that tell me they virtualized a lot more, Forrester clients, etc. But they're the early adopters, it turns out. Now, the same set of respondents reported that by next fall, they expect to have virtualized half their OS instances. So there's a lot of movement to virtual servers going on right now, from last July when this survey was fielded to next year. Now, when we ask them overall how important or how high priority are things in their organization, and we say in particular that we want to know how these compare. So very quickly, when we ask about consolidating IT infrastructure, 80% say that's a high priority. Broadly using server virtualization, also quite high, 80% of respondents. Automating the management of virtual servers, an element of things called cloud infrastructure as a service, is 60%. Building an internal private cloud was 29%, and using a cloud service provider for storage or virtual server as a service was 28%. Now those are up a little bit from last year, but this is one proof point I use to say, look, be careful how you use the cloud word, because a lot of people are talking about virtualization and equals cloud, but if I ask them specifically about cloud, the response rate drops a lot. Now remember, traditional IT folks. Now last piece on server virtualization. We have 7 best practices for server virtualization, which are effectively a checklist for getting all the way to cloud infrastructure as a service on-premise or at a service provider. So the list here: virtual first policy, live migration, boot from network storage, the VMs from network storage, automated software management of virtual servers, tracking machine usage so you know who drives usage, self-service portal, and then the last one is chargeback. And just notice here that this dark blue bar at the end is the people who said, I'm not doing it now, but I'm going to do it within 12 months, i.e. by July 2011, next month. So the numbers I'm showing you right here, the totals, are where they expected to be now. So 60% are doing virtual first, but only 12% are doing chargeback, 24% doing resource tracking. Only 6% are doing all 7 of these. So these guys are still doing a lot of things that they need to get to any form of infrastructure as a service. Now, that's not to say that they're not ready to do any infrastructure as a service. It just gives us broad perspective on where they are in the spectrum of things. Now, when we straight up ask, and we used a bunch of language beyond just cloud, what are your plans to adopt pay-per-use hosting of virtual servers, also known as infrastructure as a service? And we gave example providers. What you see here is the bottom bar is I'm using it. The middle bar is I'm planning to do it within 12 months of the survey. And the green is I'm interested, but I don't have a specific plan. So you can see 13% of companies say they would be using it by today. Doesn't sound very high, but remember, it's 13% of the IT infrastructure buyers. Now, so these buyers that I just showed you survey data for, they typically focus on back office workloads. And I don't mean to disrespect anyone in the audience, but when I'm surveying this large a sample, that's what I see. Today's popular infrastructure as a service workloads, the things you see at Amazon or via RightScale, are test and development workloads, web and consumer services, grid computing and compute intensive, and engineering and scientific kind of workloads, not the typical back office. So how do we make sense of the conversation about infrastructure as a service? It's really 2 different conversations. So there are really 2 different kinds of buyers for cloud infrastructure as a service. That is what RightScale helps you implement. On the left are the ones that are outside the traditional IT organization, whose needs and workload characteristics are pretty different than what the formal cloud buyer or the typical IT infrastructure buyer is thinking about when they look at cloud infrastructure as a service. So you can see the motivations are typically on the right, save money on IT operations as the primary goal, versus on the left, business flexibility and agility. The application types vary significantly. The architecture, stateless versus stateful. The preferred billing, this is a strong one. Often the IT infrastructure folks tell me they want stable monthly costs because that's how they're measured, is on hitting a budget, as opposed to business results driven by revenue. I don't want to walk through all of this. If you'd like a copy of the slides, let me or the RightScale folks know. I just wanted to call out this difference in sort of the type of people buying things and show you more survey data. So when we ask the infrastructure buyers, really the formal buyers, who in your company is most interested in using cloud infrastructure as a service, they point to the informal buyers in 58% of companies. It's the other guys, it's not me. Now, when we ask the software decision makers, and there were some hands in the room for you all, if they're using infrastructure as a service, the answer is yes, at double to triple the rate to the hardware infrastructure guys. So guess who's sneaking around going and getting Amazon without telling the IT infrastructure guys? And you heard the story that Michael talked about earlier of exactly that situation. Now, for those of you in IT infrastructure, the advice that Forrester gives is you should be figuring out and endorsing some solutions for meeting this demand rather than letting it go on without your knowledge or assistance. Now, when we ask about the kind of workloads that the IT infrastructure buyer knows about, they quickly point to workloads that are different than the transactional workloads that they typically worry about. So 28% of the workloads, and this is not companies but workloads that our respondents report, are what they characterize as transaction applications using this text. And notice, by the way, that their reported use of test dev versus production is almost identical. I expected to see a difference in the testing versus production for these workloads, but there wasn't one. Now, compute-intensive applications made up about 22% of the total. And the session-based applications, so think web, collab, portal servers, file servers, business intelligence, made up 50% of the workloads. So again, this is representative of how the buyers think about this, and this is what the infrastructure buyers know about. And I would expect this would tilt even more if you were able to see true total company usage in large companies. Now, let's shift gears. There's not just the notion of two kinds of buyers, there's really two different kinds of workloads. And they map somewhat to the two kinds of buyers. But on the left, you have the single instance workloads where the resilience or fault tolerance is in hardware. They're tightly coupled. This is what a traditional IT back office app looks like, whether it comes from an ISV or it's constructed. It might be that you could in fact scale with multiple instances, but you've chosen not to. If you don't choose to scale with multiple instances, then failover and fault tolerance it is a real headache without a bunch of hardware assistance and complications. Whereas the scale out approach is one where you can scale massively, tens or thousands of servers by going multiple instance, and therefore you've designed to be loosely coupled, you've built fault tolerance into the application rather than relying on the hardware. The app is stateless, and you use server virtualization, but really it's not technically required, it's just how you sort of abstract the hardware and get scaling and flexibility. So, when we look at the early customers of cloud, this is a different take on what I was showing you before. These are the kinds of workloads we see, not the back office applications, just because of the technical nature of the workloads, as I suggested on the previous slide. So this gives you a sense, a different slice of that. To give you some quick examples of the kinds of things we see, you see streaming of sporting events, promotions from Wendy's, discussion on fan boards, which is very much around different sporting events. NASDAQ market replay on demand can be quite variable. U.S. Army, drug research, Eli Lilly. This is compute intensive, really kind of batch stuff, and ditto for the Harvard Medical School. Now, USA.gov is an example of a website that had a hugely varied load, and they didn't want to pay for peak capacity. So what they did was work with, in this case I believe it was Terramark, which is now part of Verizon, to get burst capability. So they built a baseline, they contracted for the baseline, and then they pay per use on effectively the what sometimes is called bursting. And they were able to do a pretty quick migration, and Terramark was able to take care of their specific US government concerns, although it was pretty straightforward because it's a public website. So let's talk about what this means and then wrap up and do a little bit of Q&A. So if you've got questions for me, I'd love to have some dialogue. One of the things I wanted to share is, as part of my research in trying to find emerging trends, I spend time talking to startups, and I ask them as part of the conversation, where do you get your infrastructure? And not all of them are using infrastructure as a service. Some are, some aren't. But given the hype these days, in Silicon Valley's sort of trendiness, I figured, well, they're all going to be that way, right? And the answer is no. Some of them made the same calculation USA.gov did, which is they want to own the base workload, and they'll use infrastructure as a service at a provider for the variable and growth part of the workload demand. Now, the reason that they find that their base workload is cheaper isn't just because of the nature of the variable pricing. It's, in some cases, they've been able to optimize the app to specific infrastructure. And by that I mean that knowing their application and knowing the gear, they've been able to optimize and get dramatically lower costs than a cloud service provider. But that's a lot of engineering talent to spend on doing that. However, they'll tell me, I'm 50% under Amazon. I'm 70% under Amazon. But it's because they've optimized very, very carefully. So think of online backup, which is highly optimized for constant writes, not optimized to be efficient on reads when you're restoring, because they don't do that very much. So they've optimized to reduce their total price, but it's very different than a general purpose infrastructure as a service provider. You also see in this optimization area people writing code to specific hardware, such as graphics processing units or GPUs, which are highly parallel processors. And if you have a highly parallel application, turns out GPUs can be quite good, like 10x faster on that workload. So if that's the case, some people have optimized for that. Amazon now offers that as an option. Some simply prefer to dual source. They want to have some capacity themselves. And then some are just skeptical about migration risk and they don't see a big enough value to move yet. So quite an interesting spectrum of capabilities. So the basics of why cloud infrastructure as a service is economically interesting are clear, right? The just-in-time capacity, the pay-per-use, so pay as you go. And again, if you're not being held against a fixed budget, that's great. If you are, that can be a little bit of a problem. And then the highly standardized capability leads to self-service, which really fuels productivity of your employees and time to market for your business. Now, it turns out that to really make the most of these kind of economic circumstances, what you need to be able to do is scale down quickly, right? And that's where having good skills and the help of a systems management service provider helps you quickly ramp down your usage and adjust it to demand and then properly anticipate when and how to scale it back up ahead or with demand. Turns out then the design of your application matters to assist scaling. Figuring out how to isolate the parts of your application that are critical to scaling correctly. So paying attention to those details makes a big difference. And again, having expertise, having guidance is really helpful in understanding how to architect your application to scale efficiently up and down. And then finally, understanding the details of the service providers and how to match your application architecture and needs against the pricing and skills and capabilities of the different service providers makes a big difference. So, final slide, sort of trying to boil it down for you. Understand your motivations. Are you after outsourced style cost savings and sort of predictability, or are you after business flexibility? Very different requirements. Know your workload. Understand its characteristics and how to make it work for what you need, and therefore get some sense of where on this spectrum do I want to be? On-premise, service provider, both, which service provider? Get help. This is early days, as Michael was suggesting. A lot of the details matter, and it's really about not only experimentation, but flexibility and evolution through time.